Hey, hi. In this video, I'm going to show you how to configure and use Kubernetes policies in Amazon EKS using jsPolicy. As you see in this PPT or in this design diagram, this depicts, how does this policy works in Amazon EKS, right? Um, and also, I'm going to show you, how we can configure these policies and, how does this policies behaves when such scenarios are being replicated at Amazon EKS, right? So before I walk you through the complete demo, a kind request, please do subscribe my channel. That would really encourage me a lot. So with that note, let's directly, jump to this demo, okay? So first one, let me cover up the, what does this policies and how does this policy works, okay? So as the namespace, Kubernetes policies are meant to do a certain preventative, measures on the Amazon EKS, okay? So as you know, in the current enterprise world, the consumption of container workloads, that is especially managed Kubernetes cluster like Amazon EKS, is growing, okay? So when the enterprise scale level, when the consumption of the Amazon EKS cluster grows, there is a need of, achieving the required compliances at these workloads, okay? So in such cases, Kubernetes policy is the resource, which comes very handy to achieve that need. Yeah. So likewise, as you see in this picture, this picture depicts, what does this actually the policy does. Okay. So policy, as I said, we leverage Kubernetes policies to achieve the required compliances, required regulations to be achieved on your, Kubernetes workloads. Okay. So once you have an Amazon EKS cluster which is sitting in VPC, for example, like this, yeah. So on top of this Amazon EKS cluster, you're gonna deploy, policy management service of type jsPolicy, which is nothing but JavaScript policy on Amazon EKS. So this deployment is nothing but kind of a application deployment, right? Once you configure the jsPolicy deployment on Amazon EKS, then you can leverage the Kubernetes policies capabilities to achieve the required regulations on Amazon EKS, okay? And for this case, I have depicted this diagram saying like the person who is a Kubernetes SME or Kubernetes administrator who is working on this Amazon EKS, right? So he gonna hit the required operations. For example, let's say we have added the two policies. One policy which will restrict you to use the default namespace on the Amazon EKS. Okay, let's say there is a compliance needed from the Amazon EKS saying like nobody should use the default namespace. Okay, so let's say that's a use case, and we have applied policies on the EKS cluster. Okay, so in such cases, if the user is trying to deploy something on the default namespace, right, it gonna restrict the particular deployment being deployed on the Amazon EKS. Okay, similarly you can also restrict, the application deployment is supposed to be happen from a private repository only, right? So such kind of restrictions you can apply on the Amazon EKS, and after applying that JSON JavaScript policy, if the admin is trying to do those operations, he will be prohibited or he will be restricted, from doing that operations. Okay, all right. Along with that, if the user is doing the allowed use cases, okay, if he is trying to use the custom created namespaces, then he should be allowed, right? And if he is using the private images, he should be allowed. Okay, so that's what this diagram depicts. Okay, so first of all, wherever the policy is coming and acting, that operation has to be, should not be allowed, it should be prohibited, and the operations which Kubernetes administrators are doing on the Amazon EKS which are allowed should be allowed. Okay, so this is the demo scenario, and this is how we need to use the Kubernetes policies. Okay, so this is brief about the the solution. Now let's see at the real time. Okay, so for this case, what I did is I have already pre-created an Amazon EKS cluster in my AWS account. So this is the EKS cluster which is up and running fine in my EKS cluster, and I have deployed that EKS cluster previously, just a while ago, so that I can save a time, because deployment of EKS cluster in the AWS, it's very time consuming. It takes nearby 15 minutes. Yeah. So that's the reason I have already created. So okay, so that's a one hint. And one more thing is, I have already documented the commandlets that you need to run to achieve this demo scenario, and all those files are being documented in this help.json file. and I have the supporting files like the cluster creations, policy definitions, example deployments, right? All those files I have articulated in a document in this particular in this particular folder, and I'm going to share this folder in the GitHub repo. From the GitHub repo, you can download and use the same folders. Okay. All right. What I do is I'm going to walk you through these commands and I'm going to explain the respective files while I'm using those. Okay. So before we run the command to create the EKS cluster, you need to set the AWS context with using AWS CLI. So here you should have your system installed with the AWS CLI, which is a prerequisite. Once you run the command AWS configure, you have to give the AWS access key ID, AWS secret access key, the reason, and then output. Once you give that, you're going to set the context to your AWS account, and that AWS account should have a minimum permissions to work with the Amazon EKS, or else you might get some other error as well. And then I have created an Amazon EKS cluster with using EKSCTL utility, which is EKS command line tool, which is again a kind of a prerequisite here. You should have your system installed with the EKSCTL. Then only you can run the command EKSCTL create, right? So which is eventually creates a EKS cluster for us. EKS create cluster, and then we are giving the path cluster.yaml, right? The latest EKSCTL utility has the capability to take the YAML file as the specification of your cluster, or you can call it as a cluster specification file, and it contains something like this. It contains the API version, kind, and in the metadata we are giving the cluster name, reason where it needs to be deployed, and the node group descriptions, that is the node group name and the number of capacity it has to have. So after running that command, I see my cluster is up and running fine. It has gone well, right? And with using this, the using of this cluster.yaml file, which is a cluster specification file, the add-on advantage, you can maintain the life cycle or infrastructure as a code of your cluster. Okay. All right. So if I scroll down, it has taken more than 15 minutes, and I was finally able to create my EKS cluster. And you see the EKS cluster jsPolicy is ready now, right? So this is not enough. Okay, you can check. You need to do one more thing. That is try to run some example kubectl command, like kubectl get nodes, right? It should give some response, which indicates that your kubectl is also working. Okay, or you are able to communicate to your cluster with using kubectl utility. Again, if you want to use the kubectl commands, then you should have your system installed with the kubectl utility as well, or kubectl command and tool as well. Since I write the command kubectl get nodes, okay, when I run this command, I'm getting the two outputs, nothing but our default node group EC2 instances are running. Okay, all right, now we are all set. Now let's follow the helm-file.json, nothing but follow our commands. The next step is, since to install the jsPolicy application on the Amazon EKS cluster, we are using Helm repository. So I need to update the Helm repos of my local laptop first by using this command. That is Helm repo update. So I'm going to update my local repositories of Helm by running this command. Once you hit the command, it should show you successfully updated the Helm repo. Happy helming. So update complete, happy helming, which indicates that Helm has updated the local repositories. So we are done with the first command. Let's go to the next command, which will actually install jsPolicy application on EKS cluster. Okay, so without this application, your policy not going to work. Henceforth, this deployment is very, very important. Okay, this is a kind of a prerequisite for your policy to work on Amazon EKS. Now I'm going to run the same command now. So let me copy properly. I didn't copy properly. So let me run this. I'm going to explain what does this. We are using the Helm, installing the Helm, and we are installing the jsPolicy namespace we are creating is jsPolicy namespace, right? And finally, we are pointing the Helm charts belongs to this .sh file, and we are generating the name. Okay, so click enter to start the jsPolicy application configuration on our EKS cluster, which is a prerequisite for your application Kubernetes cluster policies to work. Okay, so if I can go back to the diagram, so whatever you see in the yellow part, so that you can think it like you are deploying a jsPolicy pods on your EKS cluster, okay? And with using that application capability only, you can insert your policies, and then only the policy will start to work. Okay, so this is the prerequisite here. Let's wait for few seconds so that the Helm install jsPolicy gets completed. Here you go, right? It has successfully deployed. If you can see this output, the name of the deployment is jsPolicy. The last deployed namespace is this one, and you see the status, right? Is deployed. So we are good with that steps. Okay. Now let's go to the next steps. The next step is you need to configure the jsPolicy, that is a JavaScript policies. Before that, let's see the status of our the jsPolicy pods. All right, I'm gonna copy the command again. So just now we have deployed the jsPolicy application, right? So now I'm seeing the status of the pods belongs to that jsPolicy namespace. You see the pod is up and running fine, okay, which is a good sign, and it indicates that the jsPolicy application going to work. Now what we do is, now we gonna apply a policy, example policy as I explained. Like let's deploy a policy which will restrict the deployment to a default namespace. Okay, so to do that I need to run this command. So here the command is kubectl apply deny default nsPolicy.yaml file. So I have this YAML file. I'm gonna walk you through that. So we are doing nothing but we are just running a specification file. In this specification file, we declare what is the policy is all about. So I will walk you through that policy file. So this is a deny default nsPolicy. Deny default nsPolicy. This is the policy. If you see this syntax of this specification file, the here API version is policy.jsonfile.com, and it's a version 1 beta 1, and the kind you see, right, it's a jsPolicy, in the sense now you have hosted the jsPolicy application first. Now you are using the kind, in the sense once that pod is running fine, you're gonna use the jsPolicies and create the instances of policies. Okay, so we are giving this as a names, and then in the specification file, if you see right here, the type is validating. There are certain types of policies like validating, restricting, etc., etc. So here we are using the validating. In the operation, we are doing the create. So we are validating the operations like type create, and the resource we are marking to all resources needs to be validated. Scope equal to namespace scope, in the sense deployment happening to the namespaces. And then once that all conditions are true, then it will execute this JavaScript. Maybe the Kubernetes is been built with using Java, right? So that's the reason we are executing the JavaScript. I'm just joking. Okay, so maybe that could be the reason that we are using the JavaScript here. Okay, all right. So request.namespace equal to default, then it gonna run a deny function with the error message saying like creation of the resources within the default namespace is not allowed. Okay, so I'm gonna add few more characters so that you can identify. Okay, not allowed. Okay, all right. Now what we do is let's deploy this. Let's deploy this application. Let's deploy this policy on the Amazon EKS cluster. I'm gonna hit enter. So it's a matter of seconds deployment. Okay, so basically what we are doing is you are adding some instance of policy. Okay, so if you see here, jsPolicy, JavaScript policy.policy, jsPolicy. Okay, so deny default namespace.example.com is created. Now our policy is been created. Okay, so in the sense, if I can go back to the diagram again, now you see the yellow part is all set. Let's do the operation. In the sense, let's try to deploy some application belong to let's deploy an application pointing to the default namespace. Okay, and that operation has to be barred. The symbol you see, which is nothing but barred. Okay, or prevented or restricted. We should see the restricted response. Okay, so if I can, so now it is time to test it. To test the to test that policy scenarios, I'm gonna just run one application. So here what I'm doing is we are creating the kubectl create, and what we are creating, we are deploying an nginx application. So if you see the nginx.yaml file, so I have the nginx.yaml file. So in this nginx.yaml file, if you see, I'm deploying a pod. Okay, so here version is v1, kind is pod, metadata is you see the name is metadata. And this is very important. Okay, so if it is not default, then maybe it's gonna deploy. But since we are restricting to not to deploy in the default namespace, And that's the reason, we have added this policy called default. And in the role, you see the role is web. In the specs, okay, or in the specifications, containers, we are pointing to deploy Nginx application here, okay. And the ports are HTTP and the TSA ports, okay. All right. Now what I do is I'm gonna hit this command. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm trying to deploy Nginx application on the EKS. If you see the response, this is the expected response, okay. It says error from the server and the error response is forbidden. This is what we want. Error when creating the Nginx applications admission webbook, okay. And if you see here, so the response is deny default namespace, okay. The creation of, you see the message, the creation of the resource within the default namespace is not allowed, and the exclamatory marks. And that's what we have did, right? So if you see here, this is message is being printed now, which indicates why does that particular user is not able to deploy that application, okay. So this message is going to give some certain information to him, right? So our deployment is working fine. So this is a good use test cases, okay. What about the converse of, in the sense this policy should not block every deployment, right? It should block only if you are pointing to the default namespace. So for that case also, now let's run a converse one, okay. Let's run a converse test case. So what is that? So we're gonna create another namespace called web, and we're gonna deploy a same Nginx application there. So it should be allowed. Okay, that is a test case here. So I'm gonna create that. kubectl create ns. Okay, so what we are doing is we are creating another namespace called web. Okay, so if I can do kubectl, let's do kubectl get ns. So basically we have just now created web, okay. In the policy we have written not to deploy on the default one. So now let's deploy some application pointing to the web one, okay. So for that case I'm going to run kubectl create one, kubectl create, and this is the file name, okay. So if I go to this nginx.deploy, so here we are deploying the Nginx application only, but namespace which are pointing to the web one, okay. So now the test case is it should allow, okay, it should be allowed to deploy the Nginx application, okay. Maybe this file will be shared in again I'm repeating, this file will be shared in my GitHub repo, and the GitHub repo link will be shared in this video's description. You can find these files from there and try to replicate same from when you are learning this. So I'm gonna create now, I'm gonna copy this, and let's deploy the application in ns web, namespace web. Now we should not be bad, we should not be restricted now. We should be allowed to deploy the Nginx application now. And that is the test case. If you see here, right, so the deployment has passed through, which is nothing but the policy is not restricting us from using the other than default namespace, okay. That's the reason it is good case, okay. All right, so let's go to the final one. So in the final one, let's say there is one more policy we're going to deploy, which is very unique policy, which will restrict you to consume the images belongs to the public, right? If you see the create a policy to allow only the images from the ECR. Okay, so for that case, I have written this command. I'm going to explain what does this. So let's run this command, and then we're going to test it, and that's the final part of our demo. Okay, so here I'm gonna. So here basically, again, I'm deploying a policy, which is written in the specification file enforce image registry, which is exactly like like default ns policy only. So if I can walk you through that file, that is enforce image registry file. Right, so it's again policy policy.jspolicy.com beta version. So if you see here, so all those are same here, right? All these two components are same here, and inside that we are giving some metadata names. In the specification, it's again a validating type specification. In the specification types, it's gonna validate two operations: create and update, not delete. Okay, and then we're gonna check at the resources like pod deployment and stateful states. Okay. And finally, in the JavaScript, so this is the JavaScript which actually does the restrictions. In this one, we are keeping the registry. Okay, so in the sense, what does this mean? In the sense, if your image is not coming from this private repository or from this Amazon ECR, then it's gonna bar it's gonna forbidden all the deployment. Okay, so that's what this all the downline the code does, and let's do the testing of that same. Okay, so first one, let's deploy the policy first. To deploy the policy, I'm going to write a command called kubectl create enforce default policy. enforce the image registry.yaml file. And if you see here, jsPolicy jspolicy.com and / deny the untrusted registry.com, and which is created. Okay. Now we do a testing of this policy, in the sense we should be deploy an application where image is coming from the public. So for that case, again, I'm going to write a kubectl create command only, and the file this time I'm going to execute is nginx deploy.yaml file. So nginx deploy.yaml file, if you see here, the image, okay, the image is coming from the nginx, which is a publicly available images, okay, and this is a YAML specification file to deploy a nginx application, okay, and now it should be blocked. That is a test case, okay. So if I can copy this command and paste it here, kubectl create nginx deployment. So now we should be having error again, okay. So that is a test case. Why? Because here the image is coming from some other part, okay. If you see here, yes, we got the error, right, which is a good test case, okay. So in the sense, actually the policy is blocking us from deploying an application which is coming from the public repository. In the sense, the Docker image is coming from the public repository, and that's the reason it is getting blocked. Until you keep your image coming from the private Amazon ECR repository, you will not be allowed to deploy on your EKS cluster. You will not be allowed to deploy an application on your EKS cluster, okay. So likewise, we can achieve the required compliance layer, required regulations on your Amazon EKS cluster with using Kubernetes policies feature, okay. So all right, so I have shown you the required things to be shown in this video, like how you can set up the Kubernetes policy, how you can consume the policies to achieve the required compliance on your Amazon EKS cluster, okay. So this kind of scenario will come in handy when you are having managed Kubernetes infrastructure team, okay. So if you are managing the complete enterprise organizations EKS cluster infrastructure, in that case you have to have some certain policies to regulate all your workloads. So in this case you can leverage the Kubernetes policy, which I have showed in this video, okay. All right, so I have shown you complete things to be shown in this video. Finally, a kind request, please do subscribe my channel. That would really encourage me a lot. So with that note, thank you very much, and see you in the next video. Thank you.